corteges now, the outriders on the outskirts of the airport, making their way. And there will be a simple reception for the coffin when it arrives. There is a bearer party that will carry the coffin onto the C-17, and also a guard of honour founded by the RAF. Your thoughts, Catherine, watching these images?
Yeah, I mean, as Robert said, it's very moving. It does feel, this is her final farewell to Scotland, as we've said. A place she spent a lot of time in, and the people had a huge love for her. And the sun's lowering the sky. There's so many sort of symbolic, just the images. They're very strong and very symbolic. And this last bit feels quieter. There's a sort of gentleness to the end of this journey, as it feels appropriate. I think it's still, I think what was, if there was a positive of it all having to end now, I think the fact that the Queen spent her last days, and the coffin spent the first few days travelling almost the length of Scotland as well, down the East Coast, just gave so many people an opportunity to be close to her and to say their farewells. And watching a lot of people gathering in Edinburgh yesterday, and the people in the streets, there's a lot of people being surprised about how emotional they felt and how they wanted to pay respects, but actually found it much more sentimental and much more moving than simply saying goodbye to the leader of the country. It was sort of saying goodbye to someone they felt they had a connection to and they knew. And I think we'll see that, as Robert said, when she does move down to London, and I think we'll see clearly the same crowds and reactions in the south as well. And I think there'll be so many people who will either have a connection to her, whether they've met her or been somewhere where she's been, or just having just grown up with her or lived a life with them. There's I think we just have countless people feeling they want to be part of this moment, and it does feel that it's a very difficult moment in time, but it's a real moment in history that is sort of carved into all of our lives now.
It is the simplicity of these scenes, isn't it? And I think the silence that is so moving, actually.
What was incredible was at the memorial service yesterday, as usual, everyone was seated very much in advance, and there was, organ music being played. There was a sort of gentle, respectful hush, but there was conversation. And then when the music stopped, there was still about half an hour before the ceremony started, but it went to absolute silence. And I think it's very rare you're in huge areas or groups where there's complete silence and everyone is almost caught in the same thought process, and yet with very personal reflections. But it's really a powerful moment, and I think it's wonderful that these moments, these pictures are captured, and people all over the country, now all over the world, are watching them together, and we'll have different experiences of it, but there's still a sort of community that comes together when you watch this, and we grieve as a nation, really.
Well, let's just watch as the hearse draws up by the ramp of this huge cargo plane, the RAF Globemaster. The Guard of Honour there, found by the Royal Regiment of Scotland. Princess Royal there and her husband Sir Timothy Lawrence, who, as we have said, have travelled the entire way from Balmoral and will continue on to Buckingham Palace, accompanying her mother's coffin every step of her final journey. There's a party of people there accompanying the Princess Royal there to greet the Queen's coffin. The Royal Air Force Queen's Colour Squadron. Scotland's 3 military chiefs in attendance at the airport, as is the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. Robert Harbin, such a huge aircraft for such a small coffin.
It's. I think this reflects the magnitude of the occasion. I'm just looking at the landscape beyond. I think one of the great features of the last few days has been, as the Minister was saying earlier, this Scottish landscape that the Queen loves so much. I have to say, as a Londoner, I think what's coming up a little later on will not be quite as pretty and as majestic. But the hills we saw on Sunday, as watching the coffin make its way along Deeside, the grandeur of the setting, I think, is entirely appropriate. And I think there we see the Princess Royal going to join the coffin on the plane, and I think entirely right that we have this extraordinary aircraft for such a moment.
The Lord Chamberlain and the Dean of the Chapel Royal also boarding the aircraft alongside her, the Dean of the Chapel Royal in Scotland. They will accompany the Queen's coffin on its hour-long journey to London.
It's 1 hour. The call sign, we're told, is Kitty Hawk, which it always was when the Queen was on board.
The band there of the Royal Regiment of Scotland watching on. So Robert Harbin, let's just reflect now on what is to come, because as we say farewell to the Queen in Scotland, we are expecting huge crowds to turn out in London in the days ahead. They're talking about millions of people.
I think it will be millions. I think it's going to be the greatest collective act, if you like, the greatest farewell that this nation has possibly ever seen. When you think of the modern modes of transport and communication, it's going to be something like which we haven't seen. This element of it, known as Operation Unicorn, the Scottish part of the proceedings, now comes to a close. But we know that people are flying in from all over the world to I mean, next week, over the weekend, we'll start seeing world leaders and dignitaries, but just ordinary people. As we've mentioned many times over the last few days, the Queen was Queen of 14 other countries. They've lost their head of state. They're feeling this. They all have possibly slightly different memories of the Queen. Some people in Australia will remember her first visit to Australia in 1954. What an extraordinary moment that was for Australia. She's much loved in Canada, a country she's visited more than any other. And so all these nations, people are coming from there to London right now, over the days ahead. And people from all over the UK will be coming to possibly watch the procession that we're going to see tomorrow through the streets of London as the Queen goes from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Hall. Some will hope to join the queues for the lying in state, which will then continue 24 hours a day for 4 days. And then for the final procession to Westminster Abbey for the funeral, and then down to Windsor on Monday for the committal. And I think we can safely say that every element of all those events is going to draw, as you've said, Sophie, millions of people.
And if for people who will remember when the vigil held for the Queen Mother, the scenes passing through Westminster Hall then, I mean, it was quite extraordinary.
That was an incredibly stirring moment. I mean, the grandeur of Westminster Hall. I mean, St Giles Cathedral last night was lovely.
There will be a final royal salute from the Guard of Honour before the plane takes off, and the band will be playing one verse of the national anthem, and then the C-17 will take off into the skies and head south. The engine's starting up. It will be quite a sight in the skies heading south, won't it? I think people look up, you will see that plane coming down.
I think if people can see it, if it's a glorious late afternoon there, people will be wanting to capture this sight. I hope the weather will be the same in London. I'm not sure it is. But, I mean, what a magnificent setting, what a magnificent way for our longest lived, longest reigning monarch to say final farewell to a part of the country that was as dear to her as anywhere.
And Kath Granger, you got a sense of the people who had come out yesterday and today, didn't you? The lengths that they had travelled just to be there.
Yeah, I think in all these moments you realise how many people the Queen has reached and touched, and how many people want to have sort of a final connection, a final moment with this sort of incredible figurehead in our history.
She was, of course, the most travelled monarch in history. It's extraordinary to think she didn't actually leave British soil until the age of 20. But she went on to visit pretty much everywhere, with one or two exceptions, on the planet. And no one's ever really been able to tot up the total number of miles she travelled, but largely due to the invention of the jet engine. She's circumnavigated the globe so many times, usually by air, sometimes in her beloved Britannia. Britannia, of course, is now docked not far from where we're looking at now in the docks at Leith. But flying was always part of being monarch. She didn't particularly like flying. She knew it's something she had to do. She always liked to have a St Christopher's medallion on board whichever aircraft she was flying on.
Really?
Yeah, it was one of the things whenever they were chartering a plane, because unlike most heads of state around the world who had sort of Air Force One or whatever, the Queen didn't have her own long-distance jumbo jet or anything. And whenever she was travelling, the crew always told, make sure there's a St Christopher's medallion.
Let's talk of shocking Charles for a moment as well, because while this is all taking place, he is in Northern Ireland. He has already travelled his schedule over the last few days. He's almost 74 years old himself, isn't he?
Yeah, 75 next year. He got up this morning at Holyrood House in Edinburgh, spent the day in Northern Ireland, and is now like the C-17 is on his way to London. Has very consciously wanted to take the new reign around the kingdom to show what monarchy is all about, really. Continuity, stability, unity. There's the Secretary of State of Scotland and the First Minister preparing to bid farewell. The First Minister very wisely holding on to her hat, given the size of the engines there. As the First Minister, of course, who read the lesson yesterday at St Giles's in that fabulous service.
The Lord Lieutenant, City of Edinburgh there, Robert Aldridge.
Lord Lieutenants have played a very key role in all these events in recent days. The Queen's representative in all her counties. They've all known her. They've all known the royal family very well. I think they'll be particularly feeling her loss. Everywhere she went, the first person she'd usually meet in any county would be the Lord Lieutenant.
And you have to remember the guard there, the people, they will have known her for year after year after year, won't they? That was their role, and she had every week, every year, the week, the Holyrood week. It will be very poignant for them too, won't it?
It will, and whenever she was at Balmoral, there was always a guard, often from the Royal Regiment of Scotland or from other regiments, would be up there as it wasn't a great deal of ceremonial, but they were always very proud to play a part. I think anyone who's served in uniform in any of the armed forces will feel that extra special connection, because you did serve Queen and country, and once again now King and country.
My mum was brought up northeast of Scotland, and my granddad was in the police force. So when we saw Ballater, the local towns of Aboyne and Kincardine O'Neill, the three sort of groups of police from the three towns would be asked to come along when the royal family were in residence, especially when they were having picnics and things. So my mum's got photos of my granddad with them all in uniform, sort of very discreetly, but basically looking after the royal family as they had their picnics. And he'd come back and tell my mum and my aunt about a very young version of Anne and Charles running around having their picnic. So I think, like we've said, this connection to family life that the locals, I think, really respected, and I think that warmth was there because they respect the royal family, but they saw them as a family as well in the community, and that's an incredible thing to be part of.
Preparations being made on board still on the flight deck before this huge Globemaster can take off. When it lands in London at about 6:30, 7 o'clock this evening, there will be it will be taken, the cortege, another cortege, which will travel from RAF Northolt. That's the oldest RAF base, I think, in the UK.
It's home to what used to be called the Queen's Flight, now 32 Royal Squadron, and the RAF are waiting there in some numbers. There'll be obviously a proper welcome, and then the journey will begin along the A40. I'm afraid it's not as handsome as what we're looking at now, into West London, and then through down Park Lane and through very familiar landmarks back to Buckingham Palace for what will be the Queen's last night in her palace.
And that for the family will really be a very special moment, no doubt, because that will be her last night at Buckingham Palace. After that, her coffin will be moved to Westminster Hall, it will lie in state, and then the funeral on Monday. So the last private 24 hours or so that the family will have.
Yes, it will be. It is so rather wonderful that the events of the last few days have taken her to so many of her residences from Balmoral to the Palace of Holyrood House. I was talking to some members of the royal household today who were reminiscing just what a lovely atmosphere there is at Holyrood House. It's quite intimate. I mean, it looks very grand. Obviously, it's a palace. It's very historic, but there is a sort of intimacy there, and whenever the royal family are in residence there, everybody loves it, and so from there back to Buckingham Palace, and ultimately to Windsor Castle, which is the seat of the House of Windsor, where her parents lie, where Prince Philip lies. But that's obviously for Monday. Today is a return and a preparation for the great state elements of this period of mourning.
But can we expect the family members, like the new Prince of Wales, the Princess of Wales, can we expect them to all gather tonight at Buckingham Palace? The Queen's coffin is going to the Bow Room, isn't it?
The coffin will rest in the Bow Room. I'm quite sure they'll all be coming to pay their respects, and they'll obviously be all gathering tomorrow for the procession. And it's a sort of procession like no other, because normally we think of processions down the Mall and bands playing and a great amount of spectacle and pageantry, but there will be, despite the grandeur of it, despite the history and obviously all that it represents, it will be a family. And tomorrow I would expect to see, possibly for the first time, a lot of family members who we haven't seen thus far. I mean, the Queen was extremely close, for example, to her niece and nephew, former Viscount Linley, now Earl of Snowdon, and Lady Sarah Chatto. They were devoted to her. They'd spend a lot of time with her. They will be there. A lot of the people who, from her mother's side of the family, I would expect to see them processing as well. And of course the staff, who are just utterly devoted. I think we forget at a time like this that of course members of her family are mourning their mother, but I mean there are a lot of people. There were some very emotional scenes, I'm told, at Balmoral as she left on Sunday morning. There's a real sense of losing someone to whom, I mean, love is the word, I'm afraid. It's love.
Well, the stairs have been taken up there. The band stands ready. The final royal salute will take place before one verse of the national anthem. but a huge aircraft taxiing very slowly towards the runway. It's an aircraft that's been used in Ukraine. Most recently, it's been used in those evacuations from Afghanistan, from Kabul last year. It's also been used to repatriate the bodies of British servicemen and women in years past.
It plays a key role. It's a reminder that all the military elements in what we've been seeing, the troops involved, the troops we're going to see in London later on and tomorrow, they all perform frontline roles. These ceremonial elements are something they take very seriously. They're very proud of them, but they're not what they're really there for.
So as the sun goes down over Edinburgh, Britain's longest reigning monarch leaves Scotland for the last time, a country she loved so deeply. The flight will take an hour. We will be back on BBC One as it lands at RAF Northolt, just west of London.